All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Horses to Horsepower, building the Transcontinental Railroad here at the California State Railroad Museum. My name is Jake. I'm taking you through our program here today. Are waiting on a couple classes to join us. So while we wait, we do have a music video to show you that one of our friends of the museum, Andy Fletcher, made, showcasing some of the wonderful things that we have here at the Railroad Museum. And that'll help show you some of the stuff that we won't be able to cover here today in our program, but we do want to show you for this virtual tour. So I'm going to jump into that now. Once the video is over, it'll only take about 2 minutes. We should have everybody on, and we'll go ahead and get started with.
At the California State Railroad Museum, lots of locomotives, we want to see them. Bring your questions to the information stand. The docents will answer, give them a hand. The cab poured so mighty, did it run on oil when it crossed on her pass with its toil? Where was it built? How much did it weigh? What was it like when steam ruled the day? At the California State Railroad Museum, lots of locomotives, we want to see them. Bring your questions to the information stand. The docents will answer, give them a hand. Virginia and Truckee 260. How much could it pull? How fast could it go? Virginia and Truckee engine would shine in the sun. Virginia and Truckee's a railroad you can still see run.
All right, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that song. Now that we are all here, we can go ahead and get started with our program today. As I mentioned before that song, this is Horses to Horsepower, building the Transcontinental Railroad. And I'm joining you live from the California State Railroad Museum right here in Old Sacramento State Historic Park, just a couple blocks away from the state capitol building here in Sacramento, California. And here is a great place to talk about the Transcontinental Railroad. Because this is the Transcontinental Railroad Gallery. You can see behind me one of my favorite locomotives that we have here at the Railroad Museum. This is our Governor Sanford locomotive, one of the final remaining locomotives and trains that actually ran on the Transcontinental Railroad. And I'm saying transcontinental quite a bit, but let's go ahead and break that word down before we go any further and figure out exactly what it means. So trans means across, continental means continent, and so a transcontinental railroad is any railroad that stretches from one side of a continent all the way to another. So it's not the first railroad in the United States when we're talking about the Transcontinental Railroad. In fact, there are a whole bunch of railroads already built on the East Coast. I can show you on a map. So this is what all the major railroad networks in the United States look like before the Transcontinental Railroad was built. And I want you to take a moment and think, what do you notice about this map right here? What are some things you notice? Well, something you probably notice is that there's a whole bunch of red lines over on the East Coast, but there's nothing stretching out to the west, which means if you wanted to get from the East Coast to the West Coast before the Transcontinental Railroad, you would be in a lot of trouble. You would have some very difficult route journeys in front of you. You could either walk all the way across the continent, Oregon Trail style, which would take quite a while, or you could take a really long boat ride all the way across around South America, and that would also take a really long time, and you better hope that you don't get seasick. So the Transcontinental Railroad then is what's going to change everything in the United States. It's this really long red line connecting all these other red lines on the East Coast to the West Coast. It was so important to the United States that the United States decided one railroad company was not going to cut it. We needed two railroad companies working at the exact same time. That would make it much, much faster to build this very, very long railroad. So we had two different railroad companies building this railroad. You had one starting here in Omaha, Nebraska. That's the Union Pacific. And they built out towards us here in California. At the exact same time, you had a route being built by the Central Pacific, starting right here in Sacramento, California, and building out towards the east. And eventually, these two railroads would come together in Utah, completing the Transcontinental Railroad. As you might imagine, building a railroad all the way across the continent took quite a lot of work. It took over 6 years to build this railroad and over 20,000 railroad workers to build it. And that's going to be what we talk about here today, what it was like to live before the Transcontinental Railroad was built, how it was built, who built it, and then what life was like after the Transcontinental Railroad was built, and how all this building helped make America a much more efficient place to live, much easier to get from one coast to the other. So in this program, we're going to have 3 video stations for you. In between those video stations, I'm going to come back on. We're going to do a poll question or two, a pop quiz, and I'll answer some of your questions as well. If you have an individual device, there's a Q&A that you can access, and you can just type in whatever questions you have about what railroads are like today, what they were like in the past, or any of the other things that come up in our program today. If you don't have an individual device, we'll have ways for you to ask questions as well. If you're there with a teacher, you can always write it down, and then your teacher can type it in as well when we get to the very end of our program today. All right, with that, we're going to jump into our first of these 3 video stations, and this one's going to focus on Theodore Judah, whose dream for the Transcontinental Railroad changed life in America forever.
Have you ever had a dream, or have you just wanted to do something so badly no one was going to stop you? Well, that's how Theodore Judah felt about building the Transcontinental Railroad. It was his dream to build it, and no one was going to stop him from doing so. But what is the Transcontinental Railroad, and why was Judah's dream of building it so important? Well, for one thing, California had just had a gold rush, and people from all over were coming to California to try and find their fortune. But at the time, there were only 3 ways you could get here. The first way was to walk or ride a horse all the way across the entire country. This could take anywhere from 6 to 8 months, and it was very difficult to travel this way. Many people didn't survive the trip west. Another way you could get to California was to board a boat in New York and sail all the way down around the bottom of South America and back up to California. This trip also took about 6 months. The final way you could get here was by boarding a boat in New York, sailing down to Panama, walking through the jungles of Panama, and then boarding another ship and sailing back up to California. This way only took about 3 months, but people often caught deadly diseases such as malaria and yellow fever. This created the opportunity for Judah's dream of the Transcontinental Railroad, which would allow people to cross the country in days rather than months. From the time Theodore Judah was a child, he loved railroads. In fact, when he was just 14 years old, he was helping to run a railroad in New York. When he turned 28, he got an offer to help build a railroad in California from Sacramento to Folsom. He quickly accepted this job offer, and he and his wife Anna left for California. Although this project didn't last long, it was his opportunity to start working on getting the Transcontinental Railroad built. Once in California, Judah started to do a survey of his desired route from Sacramento through the Sierra Nevada mountains. Judah's wife Anna often accompanied him during these surveying trips. She helped keep him organized and even helped sketch the surveyed land. Eventually, after about a year of surveying, Judah found a route through the Sierra Nevada mountains at Dutch Flat. Judah went to the Congress in Washington, D.C. to try and get funding to build this railroad. But unfortunately, this attempt was unsuccessful due to many different opinions on where this route should actually be. Upon returning to California, he went to San Francisco to look for investors, but again was turned away as interest lied in shipping rather than trains. Eventually, Judah received help from 4 wealthy businessmen in Sacramento named Leland Stanford, Charles Crocker, Collis Huntington, and Mark Hopkins. They would later be nicknamed the Big Four, or the Associates. They provided Judah with money so that he could complete his survey of the Sierra Nevada mountains as well as make a map of his preferred route. Now, armed with this knowledge and this map, Judah and Anna went back to Congress in Washington, D.C. once again to convince them again to build the Transcontinental Railroad. And this time in July of 1862, Judah was able to convince Congress of the need of the Transcontinental Railroad, and Abraham Lincoln signed it into law. Lincoln saw Judah's dream of the Transcontinental Railroad as a way of unifying the nation during the Civil War, a time of great division. Eventually, Judah and the Big Four split up because of a disagreement with Judah about how the project should be run. Judah, not wanting to give up on his dream, went back to the East Coast once again to look for new help completing the project. Unfortunately, on the ship ride over to the East Coast, he contracted yellow fever and passed away shortly thereafter in New York. He never got to see his dream completed, but nevertheless, his dream of the Transcontinental Railroad changed the history of California and the country forever.
All right, folks, welcome back. So in that last station, you heard about the different routes you could take before the Transcontinental Railroad was built. And you heard about how difficult and dangerous those route options were. They would take 4 to 6 months, no matter which one you really picked, and they would have some very dangerous components to it. So for our first time of putting ourselves in the shoes of somebody that lived really, really long time ago for our program here today, I want us to put ourselves in the shoes of somebody that lived on the East Coast. Maybe you heard about the gold rush and you really wanted to get out to California before the Transcontinental Railroad was built back in the 1850s. I want you to think about which of those routes that you heard about you might have wanted to take. If you were in a classroom and you have somebody next to you, go ahead and tell the person next to you which of these 3 routes you would have taken. And if you don't have an individual device, we're going to use the reaction emojis towards the bottom to make your decision here today. So our first option here today is going to be walking across the country. That's going to be Oregon Trail style. You're going to have your horse and wagon walking alongside you all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast. If you have an individual device, go ahead and do thumbs up if that's the one you're going to want to pick. Your second option is going to be to go down to Panama by boat, walk across Panama, and then pick another boat all the way up to San Francisco. That one would be a little bit faster than the other ones, but as you saw, it was probably the most dangerous. And then last but not least, you may want to go all the way around South America for the longest option. That's our boat journey there. And you just better hope you don't get seasick for that. All right. And there is one more option that you didn't actually hear about, and that is simply to wait, to cancel your trip and just go ahead and wait till that Transcontinental Railroad was built. And then that journey would be a lot easier. I think that's the one I would actually have done. I'm not sure I'm quite brave enough to actually make that very long and dangerous journey. All right. So another thing you heard about in that program, in that last video, was about the Sierra Nevadas. You can see a picture of what a part of the Sierra Nevadas look like. That's Donner Lake. Maybe some of you have been there before. If you've been to a place like Yosemite or Lake Tahoe, that's also in the Sierra Nevada mountain range. And that is the route that Theodore Judah found. That was something that people didn't know was even possible to find. They were really worried that they may not be able to get a railroad through the Sierra Nevadas. So if you have been to the Sierra Nevadas, you might recognize rock that looks sort of like this. This is granite rock. And granite rock is used really often in things like kitchen countertops and dining room tables because it is a very strong and sturdy rock. It's very, very difficult to break granite. And that's awesome for kitchen countertops or dining room tables because we don't want those to break every time we try to make dinner or we're sitting at the table. But it's not so great if you're trying to build a railroad through mountains made of this hard granite rock. Because back in the past, they didn't have gigantic construction machines like we have today. In fact, their primary tool was this, a star drill. And so they had to get through mountains made of granite rock, basically just using this and a little bit of black powder. And so some of you might be thinking, why did they have to go through mountains? Why can't they just go up and over the mountains? Well, railroads aren't like roller coasters. They have to stay relatively flat. They can't go up and down really steep mountains like the Sierra Nevadas. And some of you also might be thinking, well, why don't they just go around the mountains then? And they would try to, but because the railroad or the Sierra Nevadas are so densely packed, they have lots and lots of mountains, they can't go around every mountain that they come across. And so since they can't go around it and they can't go up and over these mountains, that only left one option, and that was to drill directly through it, the hard granite rock of the Sierra Nevadas, using only those hand tools that I just showed you. So in our next video station, we're going to learn about the people that actually made that possible. Who did the work that made Theodore Judah's dream a possibility?
Building a railroad is tough, hard work, and the Central Pacific had the difficult task of building a railroad up and over the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Chinese immigrants made up 90% of the workforce. They graded roads, bored tunnel through solid rock, laid track, and built bridges. They had to cut down trees and clear dense brush. They cut away land in some places and filled it in other places. And they did it all by hand because there were no steam shovels, power drills, or tunneling machines. Instead, they used picks and shovels, wheelbarrows, carts, and horses. The men worked 10 hours per day, 6 days per week. Work in the Sierra was the toughest of all because of how brutal the Sierra winters were. The winter of 1866-1867 brought more than 40 snowstorms. 40! The snow was so deep, the men working up there built snow tunnels to get around it, but they kept working. The railroad ran 24-hour shifts with Chinese workers chipping and blasting away at the solid granite rock. The railroad hired more than 10,000 Chinese men to do this work. Have you ever tried to break a rock? If you have, you know it's a really difficult thing to do. Well, imagine chipping away at a mountain built of rock and building a tunnel big enough for a train to get through. From 1865 to 1867, Chinese railroad workers built 15 tunnels. The most difficult was tunnel number 6, or Summit Tunnel. This tunnel was 1,695 feet long. That's almost 5 football fields lined up end to end. The Chinese worked day and night. Using a star drill, something similar to this, one man would hold it in place while another pounded it with a big, heavy hammer. And when he hit it with the hammer, the other man would turn it a quarter turn. Hammer, turn, hammer, turn, hammer, turn, all day until they made a hole that was about 2.5 feet deep. When they had several of these holes, they put in black blasting powder, and then they packed it with straw and mud and lit a fuse. Boom! It blasted away the rock and the workers would carry away the rocks in baskets and wheelbarrows. Day after day after day after day they did this. Now, what do you think it would be like to work in a tunnel like that? It'd be cold, it would be dark, and very loud as you blasted deeper and deeper into the mountain. Your supervisor would be yelling at you to work harder, and the air would be so dusty and confined that it would be it was very difficult work. Many of the men died in blasting accidents or in avalanches in the mountains, but the Chinese continued to work hard, and they finished the tunnels in the summer of 1868. By the way, the snow was so bad the Central Pacific built 37 miles of snow sheds, like the one that we have here in the museum. Some people call that the longest barn in the world. Well, for all this work, the railroad paid Chinese workers less than white workers. By June of 1867, Chinese earned about $35 a month, which equals out to about $600 in today's dollars. White workers made more, plus the railroad paid for their food and lodging. Chinese workers wanted $40 a month and to work 8 hours a day instead of 10. When the railroad refused, 5,000 workers went on strike. It was the largest strike of its time. This was very bad timing for the Central Pacific because they had a very strict time schedule to meet. Time was money, and the more tracks they built, the more money they made. Still, they refused to pay the Chinese what they asked for, and they cut off their food supply. After a week without food, the Chinese went back to work without the raise in pay that they had demanded. But they made their point. They stood up for themselves, and it was a sign of their collective strength. The Chinese proved to be very hardworking and dependable. They had to deal with extreme prejudice from other white workers and from supervisors. But they eventually earned the respect of Stanford, Huntington, Crocker, and Hopkins, the Big Four, who could not have built the railroad without them.
All right, everybody, welcome back. So as you heard in that last station, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad was a historic accomplishment that could not have been completed without the hard work of those Chinese railroad workers. And once the Transcontinental Railroad was finally completed, people were very excited, and they were very excited to be able to go from the East Coast to the West Coast. Instead of those 4 to 6 month journeys we talked about earlier, it would now only take 7 days and 7 nights. And people were so excited about this that across the country, people prepared celebrations. But the biggest one, the most important one, was the one that happened in Promontory, Utah, between the railroad companies when they finally completed that railroad. So for that, as well as building the Transcontinental, well, actually, let's start by showing you something called the Gold Spike. So for this big celebration, they invited the vice president of the Union Pacific and the president of the Central Pacific, as well as a bunch of other famous people and important people to the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. And they had a ceremony where they would tap in the final spikes. These are what hold the railroad together. And so they made 4 ceremonial spikes that wouldn't stay on the railroad for very long, but would help commemorate this historic accomplishment. The 2 that we talk about the most here at the California State Railroad Museum are the gold spikes. There were 2 that were made by a man named David Hughes, who was a rich man who lived in San Francisco, and he was really excited for this historic accomplishment. So he made 2 of these golden spikes. They were pretty much exact copies, and he said to Leland Stanford, one of the Big Four, the president of the Central Pacific, he said, you can pick one of them and take that up to Promontory, Utah with you to have your big celebration, and I will keep the other one back here in San Francisco. And so one of them went up with Leland Stanford, and that one is currently at the Stanford University. If you're ever there at their museum, you can go ahead and see that golden spike that was at that big important event. But here at the Railroad Museum, we actually have that second gold spike that originally stayed with David Hughes. So that's really cool. If you come here in person, you'll be able to see what an historic artifact that is. So in addition to that, not only were they tapping in golden spikes, they were also sending a telegraph. A telegraph is sort of like an old-timey way of sending a text message, but without having a whole keyboard, you only have one button. And you push that, I'm not sure if you guys can hear it, but it's making a little beeping sound. And there had something called Morse code, which would turn this singular button into a whole alphabet for folks. So the way it works is there's a difference between holding these long little lines right there, these dashes. That would be where you hold down the button for a little bit longer. So you hold it down, 1, 2, 3. And then these dots are quick touches. So beep. I'm not sure if you guys can hear the beep, but the beeps sound a little bit different. And there was something called a telegrapher who would be responsible for translating these beeps into actual letters and then into words. So each letter had a different beeping sound associated with it. And so at this Golden Spike ceremony, since the whole country wanted to know all at once that the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, the telegrapher there typed out D-O-N-E, letting the whole country know all at once that the Transcontinental Railroad was finally complete. People could now move across the country in as little as 7 days and 7 nights. And because it was a huge, important event, a bunch of people let out celebratory yells commemorating the event. And since we are about halfway through our program, a little bit over that, this is a perfect time for us to have a quick stretch break. So I invite you to go ahead and stand on up, and we will celebrate the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad like they did back in 1869 with 3 huzzahs all together on the count of 3 with our power fists up in the air. All right, so on the count of 3, we're going to say huzzah 3 times, power fists in the air. All right, 1, 2, 3, huzzah! 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 All right, I hope you enjoyed commemorating the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad with me. Now that we're nice and awake and ready for the next section of our program, we can go ahead and talk about what happened after the Transcontinental Railroad was complete. So now that we had people moving across the country in as little as 7 days and 7 nights, now goods can move across the country in 7 days and 7 nights as well. So we can move not just people, but things like fruits and vegetables across the country very, very fast. And that's going to be what our final video station is going to be on, about how California agriculture was impacted by the Transcontinental Railroad. We're going to jump into that now. If you've been holding on to any questions, this is a perfect time to drop it in the Q&A. When we come back on, we're going to have a quick pop quiz and game, and then jump into our Q&A section. So 1 second while we get that video loaded for you.
At our last stop on the tour, we're going to talk about 2 things that had a powerful impact for the railroad in America: the refrigerator car and California agriculture. After the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, hundreds of people could travel by train from New York to California in about 7 days. What do you think California could send back to the East Coast? It wouldn't make much sense to send back empty train cars. How about produce? In California, the milder climates allow us to grow lots of produce year-round. Fresh fruits and vegetables like lettuce, broccoli, and oranges could be all packed into these empty boxcars and travel by rail back east. This opened the market for California farmers to feed the nation. After a week in a boxcar, the produce wouldn't be so fresh. Imagine eating a salad that was made from lettuce that was sitting out on your countertop for a week. It would get wilty, slimy, and no amount of ranch dressing would fix it. The refrigerator car would fix this problem. In the late 1870s, the refrigerator cars were introduced to the railroad. These are boxcars cooled by big blocks of ice cut from frozen ponds in the Sierra Nevada mountains. The ice would help California produce stay fresh a little longer. You're all used to it now, but really think about how this would change everything in the 1870s. Now let's pretend that we're visiting New York City in the 1870s. It's winter time and were looking for a restaurant for dinner. Most of the menus that you would read would offer preserved produce like spinach or maybe peaches. The restaurant next door visited the farmer's market at the railroad station. Their menu has salad with fresh lettuce, tomatoes, along with fresh strawberries and cream for dessert. I would want to eat fresh produce over canned. This was a game changer. You're used to it now, but think about how that changed everything in the 1870s. Today, you could travel anywhere in America, even the world, and find fresh fruits and vegetables. The refrigerator car was a pretty good system, but still, things change and improve over time. In comes the story of our next innovator, Frederick Jones. Frederick was the child of a black mother and white father. He lost both his parents by the time he was 9 years old. What Frederick was able to do over his career without the support of parents or even a formal education is truly amazing. As a young man, he held a variety of technical jobs: a foreman at a garage, a mechanical engineer, and a sergeant in World War I working as an electrician. He taught himself mechanical engineering and picked up his other skills on the job. When he was 20, he earned his engineering license. He and a partner successfully developed an electric refrigerator and established the U.S. Thermal Control Company, later called Thermo King. By the 1930s, Frederick's designs of a large electric refrigeration unit were widely being used in homes, trucks, and railroad cars. Food could be transported over long distances without worrying about melting ice. His inventions opened the door to shipping foods all around the world and started the rise of portable frozen meals. Frederick patented 60 inventions over his career. 40 of them were related to refrigeration. The next time you visit your refrigerator, pour yourself a glass of ice water and make a toast to the great contributions of Frederick Jones. Today, California is an agricultural powerhouse. We're living during California's second gold rush. If you add up the value of all the gold that was mined in California over the past 160 years, it would be worth about $25 billion. Now that's a lot of cash, but in 2019 alone, California produced over $50 billion worth of agriculture. Modern agriculture was made possible by the railroad and the inventions that refrigerated and transported our foods.
All right, folks, welcome back. In that last station, you heard about how important the Transcontinental Railroad was, not like we've been talking about just about the people getting from the East Coast to the West Coast, but also the fruits and vegetables getting from the West Coast back over to the East Coast. And that's all very important stuff. In our last section of this program, before we jump into the Q&A, I have a little game for us. The way it's going to work, I'm going to send you a couple of questions that these last that's 25 minutes or so would have answered for you. And depending on how many of those we get as a group correct, I will spin that wheel. And depending on how many points we have, we'll compare it to how many points we've gotten from past programs. So your goal is to get as many points as possible for this game. I will go ahead and launch it. Let me scroll all the way down here. All right. Let's go ahead and send out our first two questions here. And for each of these, we'll give you a little bit of time. If you have an individual device, you'll be able to answer these directly. If you don't have an individual device, tell the person next to you which one you would pick, and then we'll go from there. So our first question here is: the Transcontinental Railroad was completed on May 10th of what year? And so we got a couple different options here for you. We got 1849, we got 1902, we got 1869, and we got 1912. Our second question is: which of the following people did not help build the Transcontinental Railroad? So which of these people have you not heard about in our program this morning? Is that Theodore Judah and Anna Judah? Was that the Chinese railroad workers? Was that Abraham Lincoln? or was that Teddy Roosevelt? Who have you not heard about today during our program? All right, we'll give you guys a little bit of time to make your choices here. And we'll see how many of these we get correct. As a reminder, however many we get correct there, we will spin this wheel right here. All right, a couple more seconds. All right, let's go ahead and see how many we got right on this quiz. And it looks like, yes, the majority of us picked 1869 for that May 10th date. That was the year that the Transcontinental Railroad was finally complete. People could now move across the country in as little as 7 days and 7 nights. And then, which of the following did not help complete the railroad? Well, the answer to that was Teddy Roosevelt, a very important person, but not somebody that lived or was president, rather, during our time period here today. He was a little bit after. And so Abraham Lincoln helped fund the Transcontinental Railroad. The Chinese railroad workers, of course, built that railroad. And then Theodore and Anna Judah helped plan the railroad. So they were all involved, but Teddy Roosevelt was not. All right, so we got 2 spins out of that. I got our nice little wheel right here, and we're gonna try to get as many points as possible. So I think the highest we can get here is 28, so we're gonna keep our fingers crossed that we get 2 28s. All right. Oh, look at that, pretty good. We got 26 for that one. So almost the highest you can get. We're gonna spin one more time. All right, and we got 19, 2 pretty high scores there. So that's really awesome for us. 26 plus 19 gives us a grand total of 45 points here today. And that is actually the highest that we've had all year so far. So you guys are currently in the first place of all the programs that we've done so far this school year. So congratulations to you all. We are now at the time where we're going to be doing our Q&A. So if you've been holding on to any questions, this is your final chance to get those answered for us. I'm going to start by going through what we've gotten so far in the program. But yeah, go ahead and type in any questions that you have. We got a question asking, does the railroad still run? Could we use the railroad here today? And yes, you can still go on a train. They look a little bit different, but trains still definitely operate in the United States here today. In fact, you could still take that Transcontinental Railroad run. You could still cross the country using the railroad. It would be a little bit faster than it was before. Instead of 7 days and 7 nights, it'd probably take you about 3 or 4. The routes changed a little bit, but most of it's the same. How many people worked with Theodore Judah? So that's a great question. So when we're talking about Theodore Judah's role, we're talking about making that map, surveying and creating a map for the railroad. At that point, the team was really small. It was him and Anna Judah doing most of that work. He did have some help pointing him in the right direction, saying, hey, I think this might be a good idea. Why don't you go survey over at Dutch Flat, things like that. But for the most part, actually making that map, it was just the 2 of them working up in the Sierras. How many people were used to build the railroad? Well, on the Central Pacific side, those Chinese railroad workers we've been talking about, that's somewhere a little bit over 10,000 workers. That's a whole bunch. But if you're talking about the entirety of the Transcontinental Railroad, we're going to double that. It's going to be around 20,000 railroad workers. We got a question asking, does this train still run? The one directly behind me, this is our Sonoma. That's a great question. It does not, but it is one of my favorite here at the Railroad Museum. One thing you'll notice, if I can pan down real quick, one of the reasons it can't run, there are no tracks. There are tracks where it is, but there are no tracks leading anywhere else. And so even if it could run, it wouldn't get very far here inside the museum. But we do have railroad trains that still do operate. Let me see if I can show you that one. It's right behind me the other direction. This one right there. Yeah, right there. That one still runs on our excursion train rides, including our Polar Express run, every single year. So that's awesome for us. How many people can fit on board a train? That's another really good question. So depending on the class of travel that you have, how much money you spent on your ticket would change how many people were on your train car. So if we're going the fanciest possible one we can have, we can pan this direction. This is called our Gold Coast. This was owned by two people. And so they lived in here. There was only those two in the entirety of the car, unless they invited their friends over, things like that. And so they had the car basically all to themselves. But if you look over my other shoulder and you see this green one, that actually ran during the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. It's one of the oldest ones that we have here at the Railroad Museum. And that one would have a lot more people on it during its heyday, somewhere around 40 people or so in that one car. And that car is actually a little bit smaller than that Gold Coast I was showing you earlier. So it really depended on how much money you had to spend on your ticket. Do they use the same materials for railroad building today? Not entirely. So what the tracks themselves are made out of, and all the things like that, that can change a little bit. We make sure they're a little bit more sturdy today for what we want to do. But the basic components would be the same. Those spikes I was showing you earlier, they still use those. They still use the ballast. Those are the rocks underneath the trains. And so that's still used. And so that basic components have changed, but we've just made them a little bit sturdier, made them a little bit more efficient to use. We got a question from April asking how many tracks were used to build the railroad. That's a really wonderful question. We don't know the exact number, but we know it was in a really high amount. So they're building a railroad all the way across the continent. And so that took quite a lot of resources, a lot of track material to build. And they didn't just build it once and say, oh, we're done, we're good. They had to go back and continuously replace these tracks to make sure they were safe for trains to drive over, because these machines weigh a whole bunch. These ones right here are actually kind of small for what a train can be. This weighs about 20,000 pounds. But just about 80 years after the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, we now get big cab boards you can see over my other shoulder there, and that could weigh over 1 million pounds. And so going over tracks, they can do it, but you do have to replace them quite often to make sure that they can still run efficiently. Let's see, we got a question from Ryan asking how much did it cost to build the railroad? That's another wonderful question. And so the funding of the Transcontinental Railroad was pretty complicated, but essentially it cost several billions of dollars in today's money, billion with a B. And so this was something that was really important for the United States. So they said, even if it's going to cost us lots of money, not just money, but also land, when the Transcontinental Railroad was being built, the United States government would give the railroad land next to the railroad, and eventually the railroad would sell that land. But they understood how important the railroad was to connecting the United States. They said, even if it's going to cost us a lot of money, even if it's going to cost us a lot of land, we are willing to do that to make this happen. And so that shows how important that railroad was. I got a really good question from Kathleen here. How do they make the decisions about what artifacts end up in our museum? Why do we have this train in our museum instead of all the other ones that exist in the world? That's a really wonderful question. Broadly, most of these artifacts and trains have been donated to the museum in some capacity. And so the decision is one just based on what we have available in our collections. But in addition to that, we have a team called our curators who decide which artifacts best tell the story of the Transcontinental Railroad, as well as all the other things we talk about in our museum. And so that could be a whole program in and of itself. That's a wonderful thing to be thinking about. We have some of our artifacts here, but there are actually more artifacts not in our museum that we own that are in storage than what we can display here, just because of size limitations. But that's a wonderful thing to be thinking about. We got a question from Zoe asking how long did it take to build the whole thing? Great question. So that took a little over 6 years to build that Transcontinental Railroad. And then from there, railroads continued to be built, sort of branching out, connecting more of the United States together. And that really continued up until the 1950s, when we start to see things like cars replacing our train travel more significantly. We got a question from April asking, how fast did the trains go back then versus now? That's a really wonderful question. So in the past, a train like this one right here, it depends on where you are. If you're going uphill, obviously it's going to be slower. If you're going downhill, obviously it's going to be a little bit faster. But that would be somewhere around 30 miles an hour. Now you can go all the way up if you're going to somewhere like Japan or Europe. You could see a train going to over 200 miles an hour or in the high 170s. And so we don't have very many of that here in the United States, but it does exist. And so that's pretty cool, a lot faster than what it used to be. We got a question from Ari. How did they get the idea to build the railroad? That's a really good question as well. And this will be our last question, because I think that's all the time we have for it. But the United States knew that it wanted to replace that 4 to 6 month travel that we were talking about. And so they knew that for a long time. 4 to 6 months of travel to get across the country just was not going to cut it forever. And so they had been trying to create railroads really since they started needing to have people out here in California after our gold rush. And so the route we ended up taking is thanks to Theodore and Anna Judah making that map and getting that work done. And then the Chinese railroad workers actually building that railroad. But the United States, even before these folks started working on the railroad, understood that it was a very important process. All right, I want to thank you all so much for being here this morning. Before we go, I do want to let you know about our Adventure Pass program that gets you into 54 state parks for free. State parks are anywhere, any of the 54 state parks will have a seal like this. It gets you into 54 of them for free. If you're a fourth grader, you can have your parents Google that and get you in. Or if you're in the Sacramento area, you can just stop by the museum and we'll get you signed up for the program directly here as well. All right, thank you all so much. You were a great audience. Have a great rest of your day. Bye, everybody.